We're going to look at Amos, Obadiah, and Jonah, and see these prophets. They're in what we call the minor prophets. Again, not minor in importance, but minor because they wrote shorter messages, is really what it boils down to. And a little background on Amos. He's from a town called Tekoa in Judah, which we're familiar with, and it's about 10 miles south of Jerusalem. So, pretty much central Judah. He is sent by God to Samaria. So he's a Judean going to Samaria, going to Israel. He's sent at a time when Israel is experiencing their greatest prosperity under Jeroboam II. So he's, Israel has Jeroboam II. Judah has Uzziah as king. They've expanded their borders back to where Solomon's borders had been. Assyria is weak at this time, fighting for their lives against the kingdom to the north that's invading them and putting pressure on them. And so they've been leaving their south regions alone. So these guys are basically expanding where Assyria has pulled out in the vacuum. Now Amos, his occupation was what? Sheep breeding and fig pricking. Yeah, fig pricking. And this sycamore fig is a kind of fig that it will not get ripe unless it's got a wound on it. And if you're not familiar with how that works in different fruit, you know, your bananas, when you buy them at the store, you notice they're green sometimes they're not. And then they turn yellow as time goes on, and that's because the ripening process is actually stimulated by a certain gas in the air, ethylene. And when they ship bananas to the United States, they harvest them green, they put them in a plastic bag and seal it. And it takes all the oxygen away, and they'll stay green even until they rot, as long as they don't have oxygen. And as long as they're not exposed to that. Same thing, your apples, when they're harvested, they're actually green. Maybe a slight red blush sometimes, or they're just starting to turn. They're what's called mature, not ripe. And then what they do is when they're ready to send them to the stores, they gas them with ethylene gas. And it triggers the ripening process, and their skin turns red. They're still just as green, but their skin turns red. And then they begin ripening on inside as they get this stimulant. Well, certain plants or fruit, if they get wounded, if they get a cut, that cut will produce this ethylene gas. And that's the case with these figs. So they won't get ripe. They'll sit on the tree and rot without getting ripe if they don't get scratched. And so they would hire guys who go, and they still do it to this day. If you buy these kind of figs, you can go to the Middle East and buy them. Every one of them have a little cut on it. Because they got a guy who has to get up in that tree with a little knife and go, and so that's what Amos did. We're told this because what is he not? He said, that's right. He says, I'm neither a prophet nor the son of a prophet. And with the kind of occupation he did, probably didn't make a prophet either. And so, yeah, he's not a professional prophet that God calls him. Now, in our world, we think, oh, you know, the guy's a sheep breeder and a fig pricker, must be some uneducated buffoon. Well, no, that doesn't mean he was not literate. Because in their world, even the shepherds could read and write, and obviously he can write well. And so God chose him and sent him there. Now he makes reference to an earthquake, and in archaeological evidence of this earthquake has been found that it was somewhere between 760 755 BC. Again, somewhere around the time that he's doing his prophecy. Something else to notice about Amos's work is there's a literary device. You notice he keeps repeating the same pattern. You know, for 3 sins, even for 4, because they did this, I will do this, and I will send fire upon them. Notice it's a formulaic curse there, listing of sins and punishments, sins and punishments. And there's a stair-step pattern also of punishments. You know, you have 2 sins. The first is like the previous countries, And then the second is a new sin, and all that. And this series of curses very likely forms a chiasm. There's probably a chiastic structure here as well. Now, who was his audience?
Both Israel and Judah.
Yeah, it's really both Israel and Judah. Israel, because he addressed them directly. They got this message orally. But they're just as applicable to Judah. Judah's doing the same sins. So it's really for both. Who else is ministering at this time? Which other prophet?
Jonah comes just
Jonah.
after.
No, Jonah's the same time period. Jonah's prophesying during the time of Jeroboam II as well.
Well, in the Jonah helps in this Bible,
Yeah.
Nelson, it says that Syria's on the rise.
Yeah,
And they're starting to, because they give reference in Kings, 2
Yeah.
Kings, and Shalmaneser hasn't come yet, but he's coming.
yeah,
And the threats just seems to be building,
that's right.
right? I
Yeah,
mean,
Amos is coming.
so
Israel's unaware, I think, at the time that Amos shows up on the scene of the threat that's about to come again. Yeah, and but it has begun. You know, the stage is set.
well, they have things like they come. What's the term for serfdom? Not a serfdom. They make Israel a fief
Yeah,
or
vassal.
vassal. Yeah. Vassal. Yeah.
That's right.
So he, and then it builds. I mean, so he pays them off a little gold and silver, and then they come back for something else, and
That's
they
right.
keep coming back for different
Right.
things, and finally they carry them away.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
That's
And in
Nineveh.
fact, what's going to happen right after this, and right after Jeroboam II dies and his son takes over and is assassinated 6 months later, basically what's going to happen is it appears that Assyria came up with a strategy which we imitate with the CIA, and that's called where you destabilize a government. And so what the Assyrians did was they encouraged the next guy to assassinate the present regime, knowing that he's going to wipe out everybody in that regime. Because when he took over, you not only killed the king, you killed all of his relatives, and you killed all of his friends. Well, his friends are the leading people in the country. Your intelligentsia, your power brokers. So you wipe them out, and then you establish your own power base. And so then what they would do is they would begin helping this next guy to knock this one off. And if you notice, you go through a series where you got a king, and his son comes to the throne and gets wiped out. The whole dynasty gets wiped out. The new guy takes over. He lasts for a few years. Then his son, when he comes to the throne, isn't strong enough. He gets knocked off. And they do this about 3 times. So by the time they're ready to come and haul everybody away, there's not much left. They really got the Israelites to kill themselves off. And by the time the Assyrians come, you don't have the powerful leadership left to be able to really mount a resistance. It's a great strategy. And it's long-term thinking by the Assyrians. Now, you have an object lesson here in Amos. In Amos, you have the plumb line and the basket of fruit, of summer fruit. Those are your 2 images used to communicate truth. The plumb line and the basket of fruit here in Amos. And we'll see those things. And the real issue in Amos, the issue that Amos brings out, and primarily using the plumb line as the imagery of it, is the fact that Israel does not measure up to God's righteous standards. God has measured them, found them lacking, and now it's time to punish them. And so the dominant theme in Amos is the coming judgment. Judgment is coming. Judgment is coming. But it's not just Israel. It's Israel and her nations. In some ways, Amos is sort of like the oracles against the nations in Isaiah. He goes through the list of everybody's going to get wiped out. And it's really the same defeat that Isaiah is talking about. This is the judgment that Isaiah was alluding to in his oracles against the nations. I connect the 2 together because Assyria is going to come not just wipe out Israel, they're going to come wipe everybody out. All these people who had sort of enjoyed their independence while Assyria was in a weak stage is going to now be conquered by them. Now, again, this is a time period when Jonah's ministering, because Jonah is now sent to Nineveh. Nineveh repents, and it's that repentance that leads to the resurgence. That's why Jonah didn't want to go, and we're going to see that when we talk about the book of Jonah, because he knows that that's what's going to happen. And as long as they're weak, Israel benefits. And Jonah is the only prophet that I know of who had something good to say to Israel. I mean, he's popular. He comes and says, "You're going to have victory. Woo! Send me again, Lord." They threw a feast in my honor. Let's do it again. I mean, he's a patriot. So they don't measure up. Judgment is coming. Now, broad outline, the way that I would outline Amos is chapters 1 and 2 introduces to the idea that judgment is coming. The coming judgment on Israel and her neighbors. And in chapter 1 and 2, he goes to the list of everyone who's going to get it. And in chapters 3 through 6, basically the middle third of the book, the theme is defeat and captivity. It's going to talk about their coming defeat and the fact that they're going into captivity. So, there's no hope. And then in chapters 7 and 8, you got some visions of judgment. And this is where you have the plumb line, the basket of fruit, and all that. He has a series of visions that promises their judgment. But chapter 9, typical of the prophetic literature, chapter 9 ends in restoration. God's going to restore them someday. There's still that promise of hope at the end. And so you see dominant themes still right there. Of course, there are a couple of key players in this book. Amos himself. And then there's this guy, Amaziah, not King Amaziah, but a priest to the golden calf. So, priest of Bethel. He is not only a worshiper, but a high priest or a priest serving the false religion. Probably a part of the government leadership. And he doesn't like what he's saying for obvious reasons. So working our way through, again, you have the introduction, and he identifies himself as writing during the time of Jeroboam II and Uzziah. And so, again, we're in a time of great prosperity. The economy's booming. They feel like they're militarily strong, mostly because they have no competition. Sin is rampant, and both nations are really in a state of moral decline. Israel worse than Judah. Yeah. In Judah, Uzziah is going to be followed by Jotham, his son, who's a good king. But soon after that is going to come along Ahaz, his grandson. And it'll be a time of deep moral decline in Judah. Then you'll have a slight recovery under Hezekiah, who will be followed, though, by Manasseh, the longest, most wicked king in Judah's history. 55 years. Judah is on the precipice of both military and moral decline. Actually, they're already in moral decline. But Israel has always been declining. It's never gotten better, except, I guess you could say in a sense, when Jehu wiped out Baal worship, for a while things weren't as bad. But it's really a shift, not a change. They still stay with their calf worship. They didn't come back to Yahweh. And so here in chapters 1 and 2, you have this series of judgments. And again, notice this. Like for 3 transgressions of Damascus, and for 4, I will not turn away its punishment, because they threshed Gilead with implements of iron. Remember, Damascus is Syria. And pay attention to all the different places that he lists. Okay, so That is northeast. Damascus. And I'll send fire in the house of Hazael, which will devour the palaces of Ben-Hadad. I'll break the bar of Damascus and cut off the inhabitants of the valley of Avon. So, it's all, basically says, Syria is going to be judged northeast. And then, the 3 transgressions of Gaza, and for 4. Because they took captive the whole captivity to deliver them to Edom, I'll send a fire on the wall of Gaza and devour its palaces, and Ashdod and Ekron. Okay, so you go from northeast to southwest. Okay, and then after that, 3 transgressions of Tyre, and for 4. Tyre, northwest, and then he gets Edom, southeast. So the 4 corners. And again, notice fire, and then for 3 transgressions of the people of Ammon. Where's Ammon?
Syria, isn't it?
No, it's between Syria and Edom.
Yeah.
There's Ammon on the northern end, Moab, southern part. So see, he's gone northeast again, but not quite as far northeast. And so after he's talked about Ammon that he's going to get, then for Moab. So he finished up the eastern side. That's what he's done. So he started northeast, southwest, northwest, southeast, then the 2 countries on the east. So he finishes up the east side. There's nothing left on the west side because all you got is the Mediterranean. And then he takes care of the next one, Judah. For 3 transgressions of Judah, and for 4, I'll not turn away his punishment. Now, remember, he's addressing Israel. And at this point, they're going, Syria, yeah. Philistines, yeah. Right? Our history-long enemies. Tyre, yeah. They were our allies at first, but they've not been nice to us since. Edom, yeah, get them. They've been nothing but a pain. Ammon, Moab, yeah. Judah, oh, of course. We were broke from them. And then, for 3 transgressions of Israel, and for 4. It's sort of like draw the circle and you're the bullseye. Now, what this does to them, at this point they've gone, yes, what? And then they're instantly mad. Because to make them the last makes them the worst. See, that's the whole point. In these kind of listings, you're going and you're not just drawing the circle, but now you said you're going to get it. And what he's saying is, you've sinned just as bad as the rest, and you're going to be destroyed. You're going to be destroyed. And at first they were glad because all these other countries, they've done mean things to them, and so they're getting paid back for what they did to us. I mean, that's the way that they're thinking of is. You've sold them into slavery, you've done this, you've done that. But why are they to be destroyed? For injustice and sexual immorality. For their moral corruption. Both in how they treat their people and how they live amongst themselves. And so, God intends to judge. And they will be wiped out. And that's what he says. And so, Amos announces that. Now, chapters 3 through 6 then, you have this description of their coming judgment. Chapter 3 is where God goes over their sins. I'm going to punish you for all your iniquities. And he asks a series of rhetorical questions here. Can two walk together unless they're agreed? Well, no, they can't. Will a lion roar in the forest when he has no prey? Of course not, because he's hunting. Will a bird fall into a snare on the earth where there is no trap for it? Well, no. So all these. And if there's a calamity in a city, will not the Lord have done it? Or, I'm sovereignly in control. I'm doing things. And then he says, the lion has roared, who will not fear the Lord, has spoken, who can prophesy. And so he begins to declare the coming judgment. God is going to judge them because God is sovereign over their circumstances. And they have violated his covenant, they have violated his righteousness, and time has run out. Now notice, even though time has run out, the country is actually going to be around for about the next 40 years. But the beginning of the end was at hand. And it was a slow, miserable death for a nation. It was a series of defeats. It was a series of destructions until they're finally completely wiped out. And that's the way God's judgment worked with both Israel and Judah. It wasn't an overnight thing. If the United States comes under God's judgment, it's not that we'll get nuked. It's that we'll get chipped away. For all we know, this war on terror is that very kind of a thing. Yeah. That it's the beginning of the end. And so that there.
Sound like disaster right there.
That's right, yeah.
That's the airport. Much better. Sorry.
That's right. So, get my train of thought back here now. But judgment from God can be, from a human perspective, rather slow. It can take a whole lifetime, but it's still God judging. And so this is, and he has announced this. But in chapter 3, the judgment is sure, and it's coming, and it's going to be complete. Now, in chapter 4, he talks about why. And so, hear this word, you cows of Bashan, who are on the mountains of Samaria, who oppress the poor, who crush the needy, who say to your husbands, bring wine, let us drink. And you see again, the issue is injustice. The issue is you've got a bunch of arrogant, obnoxious people who are abusing the poor in their nation. You go, well, now just a minute, the poor are going to suffer too, aren't they? Well, actually, the way it works out, their condition probably didn't change a whole lot. I mean, okay, they're being abused in Israel. Now they get carried off captive by the Assyrians and get settled in other cities. They actually might have been treated better once they were resettled. So, in a sense, the poor aren't being punished. Really, only the wealthy are. Now, what's a cow of Bashan? I'm sure y'all have heard about this. Fat, sleek cow. How come it's a fat, sleek cow? Where is Bashan? Or Bashan?
Up above Galilee.
Yeah, it's up above Galilee, in what we think of as the Golan Heights.
Beautiful.
It's beautiful ranch country. Grass. And great cattle country. Lots of grass.
There's sleek, fat cows up there today.
That's right. 11. Yeah. And who are the cows of Bashan? It's the women. It's the women. And in their world, a fat woman was a happy woman. That was beautiful. That was great. And to be able to be obese meant you had enough food. So to refer to them as cows of Bashan is, of course, an insulting to call them a cow. Just like we don't call our wives or girlfriends a cow. Now in Texas, you might refer to a girl as a little heifer, but that's a whole different thing.
Not hefty, heifer.
Not hefty, yeah. My little heifer.
So be careful.
That's a positive. That's a positive. But a heifer is a female cow that has never been pregnant. It's a heifer until it has a calf, then it becomes a cow. So it's actually a statement that, my girlfriend's cute and she's a virgin.
Those big brown eyes.
Big brown eyes, yeah.
Only Texas.
Only
in Texas.
Texas.
If you want to insult a Texan, you call him a goat roper. There's no self-respecting cowboy would ever rope a goat.
You just shoot him.
That's right, you just shoot him, yeah. Stick the dog on him. Eat. Eat, Rufus. But, But anyhow, yeah, so these women are living in luxury. They have all they need, and of course, they're just obnoxious in their abuse. And that offended God. Because what did the Mosaic Law tell the wealthy to do with their wealth? Under the Mosaic Law.
Help the poor.
You were to help the poor. And in fact, on the Mosaic Law, if you were a part of the power base, you were to bring justice for the poor. And they're doing the opposite. And God is angry about it. So, one thing, sometimes we think of sin as idolatry, sexual immorality, but justice is as big an issue with God. In fact, maybe a bigger issue. How we treat people. There again, in the New Testament, in 1 John, when John talks about the difference between loving your brother and murdering your brother, it's whether you treat them in a loving way or whether you ignore them in their need. See? And so how we treat each other matters to God. Nationally, in the body of Christ corporately. And that's more important than a lot of other things. Now, in Deuteronomy, God had promised, in Deuteronomy 28, he had talked about in the blessings and curses what he would do if Israel or Judah fell into sin and didn't repent. And he goes to a series of steps. If nationally they began sinning, the first thing he would do would be to send famine. Okay, crops would fail. If that didn't get them to repent, then he would send drought. Because now you not only have failure of your crops, you also have a water supply problem. This would be followed by what he described as wind, mildew, and caterpillar, the locust. So you not only now have drought, but you'd have everything getting wiped out. And if that didn't get their attention, then he would send plagues and warfare. And the final stage was captivity. Okay? So this is out of Deuteronomy 28. These were the steps of God judging the nation. And if they continued in their rebellion, it got worse and worse and worse and worse and worse until they were finally carried off captive. So what he talks about here in chapter 4, when he begins talking about all the things that God did, for example, he says in verse 6, I gave you cleanness of teeth in all your cities and lack of bread in all your places, but you didn't return to me. I withheld rain from you when there was still a 3 months harvest. And you still didn't return. I gave you blight and mildew. Notice he's just following the pattern. He's saying, I've done all the things I said I would do in Deuteronomy 28. I sent among you a plague, verse 10. Verse 11, I overthrew some of you, as God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. And yet, notice over and over it says, and yet you have not returned to me. You have not returned to me. You have not returned to me. Over and over and over he says this thing. So he's driving on the point. I followed the procedures I told you I was going to follow in Deuteronomy. And then he says, for behold, he who forms mountains and creates the wind, who declares to man what his thought is and makes the morning darkness, who treads the high places of the earth, the Lord God of hosts is his name. And hear this word which I will take up against you. A lamentation, O house of Israel. The virgin of Israel has fallen. She will rise no more.
Maybe that's why Americans like disaster films. They know they deserve it, but they'd rather see it on the screen, right?
Yeah, not live through it. Yeah.
Yet,
Yeah.
they know they deserve it.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I think people, you don't have to tell them they're evil.
Yeah.
Really. They know they messed up.
Yeah. I think so. I think the average American knows our society is corrupt. So, here in chapter 5 then, he says, they need to repent because if they want to live, they better repent because judgment is coming. Judgment is coming. Here in the first 17 verses of chapter 5, it's another chiasm at the center point. At the center point of this chiasm, is verse 8, where he says, he made the Pleiades and Orion. He turns the shadow of death in the morning and makes the day dark as night. He calls for the waters of the sea and pours them out on the face of the earth. The Lord is his name. And that's the center of this section. God, the Lord, Yahweh, sovereign one. And his whole point is that God is the solution to their sins. Their only hope is to return to the Lord. They're at the final stage. And the only way of averting captivity and destruction is to turn to the Lord. And they need to return to the Lord. But are they going to? No. And that's why immediately after telling them they need to return to the Lord, notice what he does in the rest of the chapter. He follows it with two woes. And again, what's the significance of a woe beyond trying to stop a horse?
Pay attention.
Try to pay attention. Doom. There's no hope. When a prophet pronounces woe, that means it's over. I like to make the analogy from The Lord of the Rings. It's when they're in the mines of Moria and they hear the drums. And in the book it's done really well because the drums are going doom, 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 doom. And here comes the Balrog. And that's what a woe is. It's telling you, no hope, no hope. And so he pronounces these two woes against the nation, which means it's over. They've had their chance, they've blown it, and judgment is coming. And then, so he talks about the day of the Lord is coming. And he says, woe to you who desire the day of the Lord. You think it's for your benefit. Because again, in a prophetic literature, the day of the Lord was going to be followed by Messiah's reign. Going to be followed by blessing. So they're going, yeah, bring in the day of the Lord. But his whole point is this. You don't want to go into the day of the Lord because you're not going to survive it. And the problem is this too, which they didn't understand. There are several days of the Lord. The day of the Lord is a concept, is a conceptual term. It does often describe what we think of as the Great Tribulation. That day of the Lord. But it also describes any time of judgment when God avenges himself upon a nation. That's the day of the Lord too. In other words, it's the day the Lord gets his. And he's basically saying, yeah, I'm going to send you through the day of the Lord. It's not the one you're looking for, but it's one I'm planning. And so, and they're thinking, we got it all figured out. But again, he says, no, you don't. You are going to be destroyed. Now, Israel's great sin in this section, and this section actually goes all the way to halfway through chapter 6. The great sin that he's dealing with here is not injustice, but pride. Again, if you really want to get on God's bad side, be proud and arrogant. That's a horrible sin. That's Satan's sin. In fact, I think pride is probably a greater sin than most any other. If you're going to pick a sin and you have to choose between pride and adultery, just be an adulterer.
Let me write that down.
Well, since I'm picking them, and I'm going to sin.
Yeah, if you're going to sin, at least get one that's not going to get you killed as quick.
What you learned tonight at school, honey?
Oh.
Yeah, find one that's only going to hurt your family.
Yeah, you think, what's worse, adultery or pride? Well, ultimately pride is. Now, pride leads to adultery, but pride is really the beginning point. And I've seen this, seminarians, and especially seminary professors, pride is a big problem. Pride and arrogance in the academic world. A lot of these big name scholars, if you were to meet them and have to deal with them, you want to put your fist in their face. And you think, this is the guy that's being published and everybody's reading his stuff thinking, man, he's so spiritual and they're so impressed with him. And this guy is one of the most arrogant, obnoxious snots that ever walked the earth. You know, when I was trying to pick seminaries, I interviewed at both Dallas Seminary and Southwestern Seminary. They were both in Texas, so that's good. I want to go to Texas. You know, go to Texas. And I went down to Texas A&M too. That was my alma mater. And I was trying to decide between getting a doctor's degree in horticulture, greenhouse tomatoes, or Bible and theology. I had to choose between the two. Hard choice, right? No. But I interviewed the two schools to try to decide where I would go to seminary. And in both cases, I talked to the recruiting guys. And I told each of them that I was thinking of the other school. And what did they think? Well, the guy at Southwestern spent 30 minutes telling me how stupid I would be to go to Dallas Seminary. That Southwestern was the best school in the world, and anyone who had any good common sense would want to go there. And you know, it was like dumb of me even to think about something. I walked out of that interview thinking, what obnoxious snot. If this is what the school is like, I don't want to go here. And then I told the Dallas Seminary guy the same thing. I'm thinking about going to Southwestern. What do you think about that? He says, oh, Southwestern is a great school. And you know, you wouldn't do bad to go there. We'd love you to come here. But to be honest, you know, God's using them and they're great and you will benefit from it and you know, you need to find God's will between the two schools. I thought, wow. I said, you know, there's some real humility and there's a man with a level head, and if the school's like that, yeah, I want to go there. Well, I discovered he was about the only one there. That was LA. But you know, most of the faculty at Dallas Seminary were really impressed with themselves. Now, there were some really humble men there and some godly men there. I'm not saying they were all a bunch of obnoxious snots, but you'd be surprised at how many of them were just downright arrogant and impressed with themselves. And I mean, that's true everywhere. That's something that has always bugged me. And but pride really makes God angry, and yet we in the Christian world can be the worst about it. Especially when you get in a situation, you're in church and you're discussing something with someone, and they're telling you this is what it says, and you're going, you know, I studied it, and you're completely out to lunch, and I know better than you. I got my seminary degree. What do you got, ignorant animal? You know, your pride will come up. You'll be surprised how hard it is to remain humble and say, you know, I need to realize they love the Lord too. Yeah, they don't know, but it's not my job to put them down. Be gracious. Be humble. You know, and,
flushed, bright red look on your face. It's a giveaway, isn't it?
Oh yeah, it's like, ah. But you know, it's we can fall into pride, and we need to realize it makes God angry. Both for a nation, but for individuals. And I have seen when Christians get overwhelmed with themselves, overimpressed with themselves, I've watched God humble them. Or worse yet, like one incident where I watched God really take away his protection, and the man fell into sexual immorality and was destroyed by it. You know, so pride does lead to destruction. Because for you and I, our real hope is in God's protection. Just like Job, he's got to put a hedge around us. If you end up a pastor of a church, one of the things that you're going to face, this is based on what many other pastors said. I have no pastoral experience, so I've been safe. Either that or I'm too dense and haven't noticed it happening. But that's been the case on occasion too. But I heard one preacher one time talking, he was like in his 70s, and he said, yeah, you know, when you're in the pastorate, you get propositioned about once a month. Till you get real old like me, then it's only about once a quarter. And you know, if you're not right with God, and you don't have a healthy marriage, it doesn't take long until you're in bed with the wrong women. Because the opportunities are there. The dangers are there, and unless God is protecting you, you can fall into sin. Especially, and if you become proud of yourself, if arrogance and pride becomes a characteristic, they'll just simply let you be destroyed. And I think that's why a lot of these big name leaders have ended up having moral failures. It's probably pride was was the beginning point. And again, they become targets.
Well,
And you say, well, yeah, but I'm ugly. That doesn't matter. Okay, instead of once a month, it's every 6 weeks. It's a real danger, but it's pride that can really set you up. So we need to remember that. We need to remain humble before the Lord and see ourselves realistically.
Well, it's kind of humiliating just to come to the Lord in the first place,
Yeah.
So we start out on a
Humble footing.
We just start out humble, and it just seems like every time you turn around, and then you go to seminary and they humble you.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just one big, especially if you're an older guy, the young guys are all,
Blowing you out of the water.
you're going, and you go through life that way, and you think, if I could just do something good,
Yeah.
just make a really good show, like the other guys that are secular, the guys in the office that don't believe in God, they're always getting all the things. And so, and literally, you can't do that, right? It's just not yours to possess.
No. We have to
It's
really
hard.
see ourselves as servants of God. And, I was real impressed when we lived in Egypt. Our pastor, Reverend Sadiq Gerges, pastor of the church, had a master's degree from, I think, the Southwestern Seminary, which in Egypt at that time in the 60s was equivalent to a doctor's degree. I mean, you were there. He'd been offered the presidencies of a couple seminaries, and this guy was brilliant, genius. But he had gone back to Egypt. He was a native Egyptian. He'd gone back to Egypt and planted 7 churches amongst the poor. And I mean, missionaries have worked in Egypt for years and done nothing. This guy went back and planted 7 churches. So, he'd given his life to serving the Lord there. And when we knew him, he was like in his 70s, I guess, 70s or 80s. He lived to be about 90. And he started when he was about 50, planting these churches. But his congregation didn't know he had a seminary degree. Because in their culture, if they figured out he was educated, they wouldn't associate with him because they weren't, and you couldn't.
Mm-hmm.
So here he's pastoring a church of people who are clueless as to how brilliant this guy is. And it's an immature church. These are new believers. And so on Sunday, he would have to, anyone who did anything in the church that week, he'd have to thank them from the pulpit. And if he missed somebody, they'd come over to his house after church and yell at him for an hour. And he'd humbly take it. And this is a guy who was thrown in jail several times by the government because of his preaching the gospel. I mean, he's like Paul, being threatened and intimidated and all kinds of stuff, and just chugging along. And they had no clue as to the caliber of person that they were just taking for granted. I mean, I think even to this day, they probably never were aware of what it was. But the reason was, he didn't have an ego. As brilliant as he was, he didn't have an ego. And God used him greatly. But he could have had an ego. But how much of an impact would he have had? God used him greatly. But nationally, it's the same issue. A nation that becomes proud. Is the United States proud and arrogant?
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah. You know why the world hates us? Because we earned it. I mean, the reality is, again, having lived in Egypt, the typical American over in Egypt treated native Egyptians like dirt. And my dad, when he was working with Egyptians, and he treated them like real human beings. And they were so shocked by it. At first they tried to take advantage of him, but then they discovered he could out-yell them. So then, okay. Then they came to respect him, and then they came to love him. Because he's the only American that ever treated them like a real human being. And he treated them all like humans. And and they would die for him. Now the other Americans working alongside of him, they just soon kill him and look at him. But the typical American's arrogant, obnoxious snot, and treats other people from other countries like garbage. And so that's why the world hates us. But then again, that is a part of our national psyche. We often don't realize just how proud and arrogant we are. And some of that pride comes out in silly things like sports teams. So that's why I don't even root for my own alma mater. I went to the games. It was fun to watch. And if they won, that was good. If they didn't, that was good. It's not whether you win or lose. It's how many weird plays there are. And actually, one year it was, did you make a first down or not? And
is that bad? Huh?
Oh,
or
well,
you mean that good?
Yeah, it was that good. Yeah, we had the 7th ranked defense in the nation, which is why we lost all of our games, like 3-0, 6-0, because our offense would fumble the ball inside our own 20-yard line, and the enemy could then kick a field goal. Then they could win the game. We had one game where the longest play was 10 yards because the quarterback fumbled the ball and the center fell on it 10 yards downfield. And that was our best play. So they were not good. But so we weren't proud. Texans are said to be proud. Most of us aren't actually, but we love pretending we are. And but there again, there's perspective. Israel had lost it. They were proud and arrogant, and they're completely unaware of the fact that they are a little fish. They think they're a big fish in a little pond. In reality, they're a little minnow in an ocean. And there's this big shark coming, and its mouth is open, and they're completely unaware because they're just thinking, I'm hot stuff, I'm hot stuff. And God hates pride. God hates pride. So that leads us to chapter 7 and 8 and these visions. And it begins, the first 2 visions, God relents on when Amos prays for mercy. First, they're the consuming locusts. And they eat everything up, much like Joel. He goes, oh no, Israel, they can't handle it. So God says, okay, I'll relent. And then there's this consuming fire that's just burning everything. Again, this imagery we've seen in other prophetic literature. And again, he cries out, oh no, and God says, okay, I'll relent. And then he follows it with the plumb line. And notice, Amos then doesn't get alarmed. Oh, well, what's a little plumb line? He's just measuring, a little string, a little weight on it. But of course, it's the greater threat, because what has happened? God has measured them and found them inadequate. Nowadays, we don't use plumb lines as much. We got nice big levels that you can stick on a wall. But,
I still like the plumb lines.
Yeah.
Better.
Oh yeah, plumb lines are very accurate. In fact, when I put in a fence, I went with plumb lines. I would take my post, put 2 nails, on 2 sides next to each other, and I have a plumb line, and when those 2 lines were straight, that post is straight. And it's better than anything else.
You don't have to worry about bending them either.
That's right. Right. And it's great. And so, but the plumb line, the whole point is the righteous standard of the law of Moses was being applied to the nation, and they didn't make it. Now remember, they had rebelled against Judah and broken off, and they had made their own tabernacles, but they were still under the Mosaic law. They still were God's people, still was God's nation. God was ultimately their king. The Mosaic law was still their national constitution, and they had violated it. Yeah, just because they'd separated from Judah, they had not separated, as far as God was concerned, from him or their constitution, the law of Moses. And so they were, in fact, if you remember with Jeroboam the first, he'd offered him a Davidic-style dynasty if he'd be obedient. If you'll obey me, then your dynasty will endure forever, just like David's is going to. Of course, he didn't, so he said, okay, then you only get 4 generations. And none of the dynasties that followed ever obeyed him, so none of them persisted. But God was sovereignly changing over governments. He was still ultimately the owner and operator of the nation of Israel, though they were not measuring up. Now, this again is where he talks about the son of a prophet and sons of prophets. Sons of prophets were people training to become prophets. They were going to school to be a prophet. So, y'all are sons of preachers, I guess. And but then the next vision, the vision of the basket of fruit, and this ripe fruit, it's time to eat. means it's time for Israel to go into captivity. And it's really, the whole point is God's judgment is imminent. So the vision of that, the basket of ripe fruit says, just like you eat the ripe fruit when it's ripe, it's time for judgment to come. And so at the end of chapter 8, he summarizes the message of judgment. It's not just the nations around you, Israel. You're going to be judged. You're going to be wiped out. You're going to be carried off captive. And he says, since you haven't listened, when you finally really want to hear from me, it'll be too late. You're not going to get a message. After rejecting Amos, it's over. So having rejected Amos, there is no future prophetic message. In other words, I'm not sending you another Jonah. You're not going to get another Jonah with good news. And you can cry out all you want. You're not going to get another word. It's over. I remember Elijah and Elisha have already ministered. Their ministries are already done. They're during the time period of Ahab and Jezebel. So this is after Jehu. This is 50, 100 years later. So they're gone. There are no more good news prophets coming. That's the whole point. But then we move to chapter 9 and the promise of restoration. In chapter 9 it says, I saw the Lord standing by the altar. And that would be the altar of incense. And he said, strike the doorposts, that the thresholds may shake, and break them on the heads of them all. I will slay the last of them with a sword. He who flees from them shall not get away, and he who escapes from them shall not be delivered. Though they dig into hell, from there my hand will take them. Though they climb up to heaven, from there I will bring them down. And though they hide themselves on top of Carmel, the highest mountain in the country, from there I'll search and take them. Though they hide from my sight at the bottom of the sea, from there I'll command the serpent and it will bite them. Though they go into captivity before their enemies. See, even being carried off into captivity, from there I'll command the sword and it will slay them. I'll set my eyes on them for harm and not for good. So it begins by that. But then he ends the chapter, beginning in verse 11, says, on that day I will raise up the tabernacle of David which has fallen down, and repair its damages. I'll raise up its ruins and rebuild it as in the days of old, that they may possess the remnant of Edom and all the Gentiles who are called by my name, says the Lord who does this thing. Behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, when the plowman shall overtake the reaper, and the treader of grapes him who sows seed. The mountains shall drip with sweet wine, and all the hills shall flow with it. I'll bring back the captives of my people Israel. They shall build the waste cities and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and drink wine from them. They shall also make gardens and eat fruit from them. I will plant them in their land, and no longer shall they be pulled up from the land I have given them, says the Lord your God. So he says, after all this judgment, I'm going to bring them back and restore them to the land. And notice, what's the key to that restoration? The tabernacle of David. Messiah's reign. He's going to, and in Ezekiel and other places we learn, he's going to reunite North and South. And they're going to be ruled over by David's ultimate descendant. And it'll be a time of great prosperity. Again, notice the reapers, the plowers, the agrarian society blessing on their crops, which is abundance, provision, wealth. And so God's going to restore them to the land, and he's going to bring back the captives somewhere in the future. So there's this message of hope. Again, why the message of hope and restoration? Who's to benefit from that?
Everyone ultimately will.
Yeah, everyone ultimately will. But really, the believers who are being faithful in this unfaithful nation. Because remember, even at the worst times, remember what God told Elijah when he said, I'm the last one? He said, no, you're not. There's still 7,000 men who haven't bowed the knee to Baal. That's not many in the whole country, but there's still 7,000. And so there's still this righteous remnant who needs to be reminded that it is worth it to stick it out. Yes, my nation's being judged, but God is still going to restore. And when He does, I want to be in that group, or I want my kids to be in that group. So we must still live for the Lord. Because the purpose of prophetic literature is to encourage the faithful to remain faithful, not just so they know what's going to happen in the future. Well, let's take a pause. Obadiah's a little prophecy. Just a few verses here. We know nothing about Obadiah beyond his name. Means servant of Yahweh. Obadiah. Abed means servant. So, Abed Edom was the servant of Edom. Here, this is servant of Yahweh. We can't date the book. All we know is that it was written probably shortly after the fall of Jerusalem. Okay, so Obadiah would be a contemporary of Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Habakkuk, all these different guys. Daniel is around at this time. So Obadiah is writing at that time. Now, he addresses Edom, but his real audience can't be the Edomites because they're not going to get the message. His real audience is the Judeans going into captivity. That's really who gets the message and benefits from it. So the audience would be the exiled Judeans. And Edom and Judah have a long history because Edom comes from Esau, who got ripped off, as far as they're concerned, by Jacob, and they're still mad about it. And,
It's another blood feud.
that's right, another blood feud that had gone for 1,000 years. Now, one of the things that the Edomites did is anytime anybody attacked Judah, Edom helped. And actually, Judah didn't help the cause much because if you remember, King David conquered the Edomites and killed most all of them. And there was a few attempts there to wipe them out. So the Jews didn't like the Edomites any more than the Edomites liked the Jews. Let's talk a little bit about the relationship between Obadiah and Jeremiah. That's an interesting thing because there does seem to be a lot of connection between the two. And in fact, the first 5 verses here of Obadiah are very much like Jeremiah chapter 49, verses 9 and 14 through 16. There's a lot of parallels. Some scholars think one was dependent on the other, or maybe one copied the other. I'm not sure. But it may be more likely that Obadiah drew from Jeremiah, assuming that Jeremiah's work was available. Or they drew from some other common source, a saying that was common at that time or something like that, somehow. Or it's just coincidental that they said much the same thing. Now, here the key image used by Obadiah is Jacob and Esau. Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. And the relationship between Jacob and Esau. Because again, we have this long history of them fighting and hating each other. And especially of the Edomites joining every enemy they could to help fight Judah. And so the issue here in Obadiah is the fact that, we might say, am I my brother's keeper? The lack of loyalty to their relative. Because remember, in their world, here's an important concept, is nepotism is a virtue in the Middle East. If you don't take care of your family, you're worthless. And even if your family member's worthless, you take care of them. You get them a job. They'll work for you. Nepotism is a virtue, whereas we consider it a vice. You know, if a CEO hires his son better be awfully good at what he does. And you know, because it's not right. And so, but there it was. But so you took care of your relatives. Well, the Edomites are relatives to the Judeans, and they have not met their obligation culturally, societally, and by God's expectation. So, now the theme here, the dominant theme is, of course, that while Judah's being delivered, Edom will be judged. Edom's going to get their judgment. Judgment is coming. Edom, you're doomed. And the message is that God's judgment of Edom will involve total annihilation while Judah is delivered. You know, God doesn't just say, I'm going to punish you. He says, I'm going to wipe you out. And after we go through Obadiah, we'll talk a little bit about how it got fulfilled. Now, the way I would outline this, the first half of the book, verses 1 through 14, is the vision of Edom's destruction. So verse 1 through 14, he goes over Edom's destruction. He has a vision of Edom's destruction. And then verses 15 through 21 is the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord. So, one of the things that really strikes me each time I read this is he talks about the pride of Edom. And I think, Edom? Proud? And what have they got to be proud of? I mean, you go over there and there's nothing much there. So you got what?
Petra?
Yeah, but see, the worst thing is Petra's after the Edomites are gone. Petra was built by the Nabatean Arabs. And all those great monuments were done by the Nabatean Arabs who drove the Edomites out. Yeah, but you know, Edom is out in the sticks. Nothing much. Now, during their day, there was actually a lot more forests. The mountains of Edom that are now barren were forested back then, so they did have a little bit more in the way of resources and things like that. But can't imagine why they would be proud. It's one of the things that I struggled with when I first got here to Oregon. I kept hearing all this stuff about how great Oregon was. I'm thinking, great, it's a dinky little state. Oh, waterfall. Yeah, there is water falling from Multnomah Falls. Obviously, they haven't been out to Niagara Falls recently. Compare it. You know, and I mean, you know, you do have Crater Lake. There are some beautiful places here, and you know, and the state does have a certain beauty to it, but proud? No. I mean, you know, it's just a state. It's just a place to live. Maybe my perspective is different. But, you know, you wonder, what are you proud of? You don't really have anything to boast about.
Well,
that was Edom, huh?
We got a town about center of the valley we call Independence.
Yeah.
And my dad grew up around there, and that's what they're proud of.
Oh, I could see it. Yeah,
because you could come out to Oregon and do anything.
That's right, yeah.
You didn't have the California gold rush. And, you know, Washington, Seattle, the same thing. There's a lot of corruption, a lot of shaky beginnings, and a lot of stuff done without law. You know, independence.
Yeah,
we can be proud of that.
That's it, yeah. That explains it. But, you know, there's things to enjoy. This is a state to be enjoyed, but not to get all huffy about it. And, you know, Texas is the same way. It's a state, well, can it be enjoyed? Yeah, there's a few places that's nice. But, you know, it's usually either hot or swampy or humid or something. But, you know, so.
You got the Alamo, you know.
Yeah, you got the Alamo. Now, you know, the Alamo does prove one thing. You know, who was it? Jim Bowie came there with 100 Tennessee volunteers. You know, died fighting for the Alamo, which proves they would rather have died in Texas than lived in Tennessee. It's all perspective.
Well, the Edomites, in one place it says, without their their area was impregnable.
Impregnable, yeah. They were really, because they were cliff dwellers. They had built a lot of defenses up in cliffs, and that gave them a lot of self-confidence, because remember, in that world, as long as you can hold out, you can win. And they felt they could hold out. It was much like the Canaanites' attitudes. You know, when Israel came against Jericho, those walls of Jericho were humongous. And they fell. That's why Jericho fell, because the walls fell down. And God took away their defenses. But that was one of the characteristics of the Canaanite cities, was big walls, tall walls. Not near as big as Babylon's walls. I mean, Babylon's walls were massive. And that made them think they were safe. They weren't. But yeah, the Edomites, they thought they had the defenses. They had their cities perched up on these cliffs. Even like, again, Petra. The thing about Petra was when it was an Edomite city, is they thought, the only way you can get into here is through this little winding thing. We got this gate guarding it, and we can hold off an army forever because they got to come through this narrow pass, and it doesn't take too many men to block it up. We got it all covered, and then they got outsmarted. And so, all your defenses don't work if the enemy comes from within. So, he begins in the first section again, talking about their destruction. Because of their enmity for Judah. And even though they're proud and they feel secure, God says, I'm going to bring you down. And this is the famous one, even though you build your nests up in the stars, I will bring them down to earth. And people say, aha, that means the space station's going to fall. No, that's not what it means. Not a prediction of that.
Isn't that more along the lines of, I'm trying to remember earlier on when the prophet was talking about, you call the temple the temple.
That's right. Yeah, you're so confident in your defenses. They're so high, you think you're perched up there where the eagles fly and no one can touch you. I'm going to get you. Yeah, same kind of a mindset. I'm going to get you at the place where you are the most confident. And so the issue with Edom is pride. Pride and arrogance. Their pride was hurt by the fact that they got bumped from the promises. And they're still mad about that.
Were the Edomites, like Esau, he was a great hunter. Mm-hmm. That was kind of what his reputation was for. Were they followed suit in the same area? Maybe mercenaries for hire, other than just for Israel, mercenaries for other places?
No. That was basically it. Yeah, they generally didn't provide mercenary armies. They had taken Edom by killing off a race of giants. So they were pretty tough guys. The Edomites were not wimps. I think they were pretty rugged warriors. But there's no indication that they did like the Jews did, which rented themselves out as mercenaries. It doesn't look like people came to recruit them, other than they joined in on the local stuff. And they did things like he brings out here in Obadiah, that when the Judeans were fleeing from the Babylonians, what were the Edomites doing? Yeah, setting up ambushes, catching them, and turning them back over to the Babylonians. Doing the opposite of what, in their culture, they were required to do, which would be to shelter your relative. And to provide for refugees until they could go back home. So they did the opposite. And the issue is, it's your brother. It's your brother. It's interesting because in Deuteronomy 23:7, Israel is forbidden from mistreating Edomites because they're your brother. They're brothers. So don't attack them. Don't mistreat them. Treat them right. They're your brothers. So there was a mutual obligation. Edom hadn't met it. So this brings us to the second half of Obadiah, the day of the Lord. And God says the day of the Lord is coming, and there's going to be retribution, and it's going to be paid back for all the things you did against Judah, and you're going to be annihilated. God's judgment of Edom is then, in this section, extended not just to Edom, but to the whole world for how they've treated Judah and Israel. So this day of the Lord is going to stretch on out to the whole time. There's two possibilities here too. Either Edom was wiped out by the Romans, because that's where they disappear from history, or they may yet still exist, because there are prophecies of the last days of this final day of the Lord that mentions Edom being back in existence. So it could still be. This is still a possibility.
Well, didn't it, after about 65 years, the Romans tried to conquer that city? They just sort of, I mean, didn't they just sort of like make a treaty or give up? I mean, there wasn't really a final battle where the Romans went in and took over that region.
Well, actually, no, there wasn't, but by then that was the Nabatean Arabs they were dealing with and not the Edomites. The Edomites were the Idumeans who were in southern Judah by the time of the Roman era. And they actually joined up with the Jews in the revolt against Rome and were in Jerusalem and got wiped out along with the Jews when Rome wiped out Jerusalem.
Yeah, because when we were there last, you know, we had to get a Jordanian guy.
Yeah.
We had to leave.
Yeah.
Hal couldn't say anything, but he kind of made it sound like the two cultures were so intertwined you couldn't really tell them apart.
Yeah.
The Kingdoms and the Edomites were
Right.
the same people.
Yeah. Probably did eventually intermarry and absorb. Initially, in fact, the Nabateans pushed the Edomites out of Edom into southern Judah. But eventually the Nabatean Arabs did move on into southern Judah too and intermarried with them, and so they're all mixed in. And I think amongst the Palestinians and in the modern country of Jordan, you have a mixture of the Edomites, the Moabites, and the Ammonites that are still there. And it's very possible, the way God works things, that somewhere here in the near future, Jordan may get split back up into those three countries. Could happen. If not, then the references to them will be fulfilled in the last days on Jordan as a nation. In other words, a reference to those three countries is really a reference to Jordan, because he's really talking about the people groups, and they would be located in Jordan. But in verses 19 through 21, he ends the prophecy by promising that someday Judah is going to occupy their land. The south shall possess the mountains of Esau, and the lowland shall possess Philistia. They'll possess the fields of Ephraim and the fields of Samaria. Benjamin will possess Gilead, and the captives of the host of the children of Israel shall possess the land of the Canaanites. As far as Zarephath, the captives of Jerusalem who are in Shapharad shall possess the cities of the south. Then saviors shall come to Mount Zion to judge the mountains of Esau, and the kingdom shall be the Lord's. So the day of the Lord, at the end of it, is coming, and Judah and Israel is going to occupy not just Edom, but Philistia and all the other territories that were given to them originally. So, where God is judging Judah at the time that Obadiah is written, and they're going into Babylonian captivity. Again, notice even Obadiah ends with the promise of restoration of the nation of Israel. So Edom will be wiped out. Israel will be restored. That's what he teaches. Now, here's the history of what happened to Edom, and you can flesh this out. Is the Edomites were going along, and everything was fine, and what happened was after the Babylonian captivity, the Edomites moved into southern Judah. The Negev region. They sort of took over all the empty space down there. They didn't move up into main part of Judah. That stayed unoccupied for about 50 to 70 years during the Babylonian captivity. Judah itself mostly was completely empty. Nobody lived there for about 50 years. But it's during this time period, the Nabatean Arabs, what they had done is they had found a series of oases in the Arabian desert, and they ran caravans across the Arabian desert from one oasis to the next. So they knew where all the water was. Well, their caravan route came to Petra. And if you've been to Petra, you know about it. They had cisterns, and they had a water collection system where when it did rain, they collected all the water into these cisterns, and they had a good water supply. And to get to the city, you had to go through this real narrow ravine that's like 1,500 feet high, rock walls, and about as wide as this room. And I mean, so it's easily defended. It had a gate that you had to go through, and you'd wind through it, and you'd come out into this enclosed valley where they had all their supplies. Nowadays, you know, after the Nabatean Arabs, when you come to the end of this thing, you see the Indiana's Temple of Doom. You see this big facade. You think, wow, what a massive structure, and you discover it's got a tomb in it about the size of this room. That's it. So the humongous facade for this one little tomb. But that's what greets you, and then you take a right turn and you go on into this big valley area, and you got all these different tombs and all this kind of stuff that's hidden back in there. And there was a whole city built there. I mean, now they've excavated temples and all kinds of neat stuff. It's a great sight to go see. But at that time, you know, you had that. Well, what the Nabateans did was they realized, you know, we want their water supply. Because they were stopping off there and having to pay for water and rent and that kind of stuff. And they had a hotel set up for them. And, of course, the Edomites had a great business going because the Nabatean Arabs were coming through. But they said, you know, we'd like to have this. Wow, pay. So they had a caravan come in one day. And instead of having, you know, pottery and cooking stuff and, you know, this and that in their sacks, they had shields and swords and breastplates and weapons. And these caravan carriers were soldiers. And sneaking in behind them was a whole army, you know, hiding behind the hills. And so these guys come in like a regular caravan, and they take them right to the hotel, and they set up. And then in the middle of the night, they don their equipment, and they go and knock off the guard and take control of the front gate and let in the army. And the city falls through deception to the Nabateans, which is what Obadiah promised. And they kicked the Edomites out. And ultimately what happened is the Nabatean Arabs then came in and took over Edom. And they drove the Edomites into southern Judah, and then they, of course, continued to expand and, like I said, intermarried eventually. But Edom was expelled from their territory by this Arab group. Now the Edomites during the Maccabean period then were conquered by the Maccabees, forced to be circumcised, and become Jews. And that's why Herod the Great, his father was an Edomite, his mother was a Jewess. So he was actually, by Jewish definition, a Jew. But they didn't like him. His dad was an Edomite, so they thought of him as an Edomite. And that's why they hated him as king. But the Idumeans, as the Romans called them, were really absorbed into Judea in that sense. They were ethnically still distinct, but they were part of Judea. Now, when the Jews revolted in 66 AD, the Edomites joined them in their revolt. And they were in Jerusalem when Jerusalem fell. They got wiped out along with them. And they sort of disappeared from history after that. Because they're just lumped in with the Jews as far as the Romans are concerned. They are probably, like I said, probably amongst the Palestinians, the Jordanians. They're still there. Now, interestingly enough, what happened with the Nabatean Arabs is when the gospel went to went out, the Nabatean Arabs became Christians. And in fact, the oldest churches we have found and we have excavated are Nabatean Arab churches. And the oldest baptistries were baptistries by the Nabatean Arabs. And so they were Christians until the Muslim takeover.
So the Nabateans built Petra, or the Edomites built Petra?
The Edomites had a village there, think of it that way.
It was actually the Nabateans.
But it was actually the Nabateans who built it and built all those tombs and all those big monuments and those kinds of things. That was done by the Nabateans after they had driven the Edomites out. And Petra was their key stop-off point for their caravans. It was the water supply. And that was the issue. It's sort of like in the movie Lawrence of Arabia. You know, Lawrence of Arabia is all about water. Because over there, water was everything. And same thing, it was all about water. And so God fulfilled this curse on them using, I believe, the Nabatean Arabs and then the Romans but also that he is going to ultimately fulfill it in the day of the Lord. Because have they been friends of Israel? No. They still are the enemies, they're still the enemies of Israel. It is interesting that Jordan, of all the countries, is the least hostile, but the citizens of Jordan are very hostile towards Israel. And towards the typical Muslim over there is very hostile towards Christians. I have a friend who's started a seminary over there, Jordan Evangelical Theological Seminary. And he's been told by Arabs, he says, just like Sunday follows Saturday, after we wiped out the Jews, the Christians are next. He's told that regularly. So they are very hostile even now to the gospel.
At least he's second on the list.
That's right, at least he's second. Yeah. And this is a guy who has been threatening to him. In fact, when he was a Jordanian citizen, at one point he planted a church, and he was arrested and went before 13 different judges, and they had taken his wife and kids captive, and they were threatening to kill his wife and kids if he would not recant. And finally, at the point where he was about to break, he tells the story that the 13th judge said, well, it's like this. We won't make you recant. You've got to get out of town. Don't do a church in our town. And I'll release you. He said, okay, I won't do a church in your town. And so he released him, his wife and kids, and he went 5 miles over and did the church there so everyone could still make it. And he eventually had to leave the country, came to the United States, got U.S. citizenship, and went back as a U.S. citizen. He could get in as a U.S. citizen, not as a Jordanian. He's Palestinian. I mean, his family was Palestinians who fled Israel in 48 or 67, whatever it was, and didn't get to go back and that kind of stuff. But a Christian, a godly man, and has done a great work over there in the seminary. Let's take another pause, and then we'll look at Jonah.